The concept of canon is going to be so important for us that I wanted to go back over it again uh, in addition to class and to give you this video to be able to go back to think through it, both in terms of what is a canon and then also specifically all of the many texts and kind of questions that we might have about the Hindu canon. Okay, so what is a canon? It is a collected group of texts that are perceived to be authoritative. They might, in the case of religious studies or a particular religion, they might be understood to be authentic, which could mean from a specific writer, the emphasis on the author, and very often that author may really be understood to be God, that they are authentically divine. On the other hand, they might be understood to authentically have been written down by a person who's trusted in a religion's tradition, and that therefore a kind of chain of transmission over time makes the text authentic, right? But in that way is less useful for us for using canon as an analysis than seeing it as a group of texts that people decide are authoritative, right? That religious practitioners might not emphasize that human work of creating a canon and then maybe continuously pondering either what should be included in it or why those things that have been included are even there in the first place and what that means, okay? So Hindu canon is, if we look at all of the texts, it's a huge body of texts and they do all different kinds of things. We could certainly see all different kinds of the dimensions of religion across the different texts as well as within individual texts. And so there's two terms that are emphasized in Hinduism for understanding canon, right? These are sort of the internal vocabulary, whereas canon is our secondary scholarly vocabulary, right? So vocabulary within Hinduism includes the category of revelation or shruti, which means what is heard. And this makes sense in Hinduism because this category applies only to the Vedas, only to these extremely old texts that date back thousands of years, that are understood by practitioners to have been basically the truths that are in the reverberations of the universe, that certain sages were so in tune with the universe that they were able to hear and transcribe. This category also combines with religious hierarchy in Hinduism and relates to caste, that the only people who are allowed to read and teach the Vedas, Shruti, are Brahmins, the very top caste, okay? And so then part of what happens with the development of other texts, of what are called tradition or smriti, what is remembered, this means that they are very, very important, but they don't have the same level of authority as the Vedas, which we sort of see then that there's a tension. There's a tension between how the tradition understands, how people in the tradition understand what is most important. I think that if you ask many Hindus, what are the sacred texts, they would say the Vedas. But if you ask them, do you know what's in the Vedas? Have you read them? They would say no. They're prohibited from reading them, and they may not have any interest in reading them. So we have then these whole other groups of texts that develop over time as Hinduism develops, it changes, is influenced by Buddhism, by another religious tradition that grows in India called Jainism. These things influence the rest of what develops in the Hindu canon, right? So then we have things like the epics, which we'll study, the Upanishads, which are philosophical texts that engage certain statements in the Vedas. And so in some way they rely on these older texts, but in many ways they reinterpret the Vedas. They find new meaning, and justify maybe new practices in ways that sort of subvert the Vedas. Okay, so the Upanishads by some are seen as very, very important, nearly on the same level as Revelation for some, but for others, they're almost heresy. They're almost unacceptable because there are places where they change or subvert the instructions and practices of the Vedas. So these other texts, especially the epics, the like the Ramayana, or what we'll read excerpts from the Bhagavad Gita, these are stories. These are long stories that are use characters. The deities appear. There are human characters. They do all kinds of things. So it's not necessarily it's a narrative, and it's not necessarily explicitly some kind of commandment for what to do or not to do. On the other hand, these are very, very popular texts that people read, retell, tell their family, tell their students. They're a huge part of popular culture. They're performed, they're shown on TV, there are cartoon versions, right? So if I wanted to say what are the most important texts in Hinduism, one way would be to look within the tradition, where the obvious answer would be the Vedas. But if I want to look at what people really do, the Vedas are not really the answer. That today I would say maybe the epics are the most important, because these are the stories that people tell and retell, right? That these reflect what people actually do. Moreover, compared to the Vedas, there are very different deities that are important, as described in the Puranas, which are a body of sort of sacred stories that describe different deities that are important and accessible to people today, whether today is in the time period of the authorship of those texts, which is about 1,000 years, beginning in the Common Era, or the today of those who are reading the Puranas, that they remain really, really important. But there are so many of them. There's no single one that we would point to as important, but they're important as a body of texts. And they develop concepts of deities who don't appear in the Vedas. So they look like the Vedas in that they describe different deities, and always understand all of those deities essentially to be part of the unity of Brahman, the sort of over God, the world God. But the deities are different, right? That when we compare the Vedas and the Puranas, we see that the deities that people choose to study and worship and revere change over time, right? So that sort of polytheistic idea about the deities remains a, in across texts from the Vedas to the Puranas, but on the other hand, the Puranas introduce change by shifting to focus on different deities and describing them as having maybe different powers or different influence on people's lives than the deities that are described in the Vedas.